I want to take a quick second to just say a thank you, one, for coming online, in person. It's been great. IHR was my sort of home away from home, London away from Newcastle. And it's exciting to come back now as a non-PhD and present things that are not graphs to you all. I also want to say thank you. Some of you who are in the room and also online and maybe listening, since this is being recorded, have heard snippets of this paper at various places, and the feedback I've received has always been constructive and supportive and encouraging, and it just, to me, reinforces what a great community of scholars we have. So thank you for that, and I hope the question session after this generates the same vibe. So without further ado, we are going to get into whose costume, whose body. Fancy dress shops have long been a favorite site for frivolity and fun costume, presenting the eager consumer with a vast range of characters and personalities to consider, select, purchase, and embody for an evening's entertainment. This consumer experience, most commonly associated with angels, Mad World, or Party City, is not a new phenomenon. The commercialization of costume dates to the 18th century, when many London masquerade warehouses provided early modern shoppers with a range of character, fancy dress, and domino suits to fit their fancy. Now here we have a quick selection. Harlequin, there's a monk behind him for the character options, the domino in the middle, a neutral option. And on the far side, fancy dress, which in this instance, the Duchess of Ancaster dressed in Van Dyck style. So within these, the Van Dyck, Rubens, fancy dress, and the domino were more passive, while the characters included an engaging component where you were encouraged to act the part. Oftentimes, printed volumes depicted various national dress and creative thematic costumes, which served as sources of inspiration and acted as preliminary costume catalogs, providing consumers with an array of visual choices, much like walking up and down the aisles at Angel's fancy dress when it was open. Dresses of different nations. Thomas Jeffrey's 1757 2-volume publication, which eventually grew to 4 volumes in 1771, was one of the most commonly used sources circulating in the warehouses and theater industries to serve as references for historic, character, and national dress. Jeffreys was an engraver and a geographer to the royal family. You can see his trade card here, receiving patronage from the Prince of Wales, Frederick, and later George III, giving his work credibility through association and position. It is clear through the detailed illustrations across his 4 volumes and the attention to ethnic and national differentiation that Jeffreys worked to circulate accurate and authentic depictions of varied peoples in his dresses of different nations. However, the sources of inspiration remain unknown due to the lack of a surviving record of his enterprise. The existing paper trail for Jeffreys' business sheds limited light on the sources that inspired his maps and even less on the series of volumes. However, both these types of publications reflected his positionality within the colonizing process and thus impacted his and his viewers' perceptions of these peoples, whether intentional or not. The appearance of the volumes in relation to masquerade dress surfaces across varied sources, ranging from personal correspondence to warehouse advertisements to inventories, and indicates that contemporaries viewed them as useful references. The volume's role as a central costume catalog in masquerade culture introduced masqueraders to a range of dress options they might not have encountered otherwise, and gave them the opportunity to select, purchase, and embody another identity. Among the options available within the volumes were various exotic peoples, including Africans, indigenous North Americans, Chinese, Turkish, and Indians, many of whom appeared frequently in warehouse advertisements and masquerade spaces. Using the images from Jeffreys as visual reference points allowed masquerade and later fancy dress participants to engage in racial impersonation, which laid the foundation for widely accepted cultural appropriation practices of these groups and others in the 19th century costume leisure culture. Bringing these costumes into masquerade and fancy dress entertainments shifted these cultures and peoples into consumable characters and types, referred to in this paper as characters of empire, that could be embodied by anyone who desired to dress the part. I do need to make a quick clarification. I'm not saying that masquerade and fancy dress consumers never encountered these peoples before, prior to seeing Jeffrey's volumes, because they did appear across culture in literature, theater, print culture, but rather that this volume offered a novel opportunity to make these people into a commodity and wear them, begging the question, whose costume, whose body? Dresses of different nations is one important remnant of past practices that exhibits how characters of empire were consumed and embodied as a leisure pastime. This paper draws on these volumes, as well as a series of case studies to examine the relationship between racial impersonation, cultural appropriation, and individual agency. Just a quick note, these are some of the images from existing masquerade visual culture. The top two on the outsides that are blue and white are taken from Handkerchief. The other two are depictions of masquerade scenes in the 1770s and 80s, where you can see sort of a range of these exotic characters of empire. So for our case studies, the paper is going to be split into two sections. The first one is whose costume, the second is whose body. So whose costume is going to look at two main examples of white bodies in ethnic or racial dress, while the second section, whose body, looks at the experiences of persons of color and their assumed characters of the masquerade. The question of whose costume interrogates how particular masquerade habits work to establish and spread practices of cultural appropriation through racial impersonation. It draws on manuscripts of newspaper reports to examine the experiences of Edward Burney and Sophia Plowden, among others, all of whom were upper middling white Britons and chose authentic ethnic dress as masquerade habits. The question of whose body dissects the complexity of bodily autonomy through a study of the experiences of Julius Soubise, of formerly enslaved Afro-Caribbean, and Tyan Venega, Christian named Joseph Brandt, who was a Mohawk. And these men dressed as characters of empire, Mungo and a Native American, respectively. It has been much more challenging to recover their voices, as neither leave any documentation of their experiences at the masquerade or dressing in character. So in absence of their voices, I have pulled evidence from a range of sources, including manuscript, newspaper, and literature, in an attempt to consider the structures around them, their own self-awareness, and how they use the masquerade as a space of agency, despite having limited costume choices. Their experiences combined present a varied picture of the masquerade experience across ethnic boundaries. So while depictions and representations of characters of empire have received attention in art history, literature, and performance studies, there's been relatively little done on their significance within commercial fancy dress spaces. Verity Wilson's recent Dressing Up, A History of Fancy Dress in Britain, engages with Britain's history of fancy dress, but does not spend much time considering the harmful and hegemonic nature of this practice, nor its legacy prior to 1850. The section on cowboys and Indians is particularly problematic, as it circulates romanticized tropes and amalgamates the distinct indigenous peoples of North America into one singular category. Benjamin Wilde's Carnival to Catwalk, however, provides important insight into fancy dress within a wider global context and clearly defines fancy dress through an analysis of what it is and what it is not. Wilde establishes fancy dress as an imaginative and performative form of dress that is worn within a limited but specific time and space, usually disrupting, quote, the place of the individual within the social and political relationships of a specific community. This paper engages with Wilde's definition of fancy dress to examine fancy dress across a series of case studies in order to analyze the practices of purchasing or constructing, wearing, and performing a racialized costume within a leisure space and how that reflected wider hegemonic trends and cultural values. In lieu of the absence of scholarship on fancy dress, as Wilde points out in his own work, the existing work in the fields of art history, literature, and performance studies has been essential to understanding the cultural currency of costume and character in other forms, particularly portraiture, literature, and theater. Beth Boakes-Tobin highlights the use of indigenous North American costume and persons of color in colonial portraiture, noting their significance as a form of identity construction, othering, and how this contributed to a wider production of colonial meaning and hegemony. Tim Fulford and Robbie Richardson likewise provide important scholarship on the shifting identity of Indigenous North Americans in literature and the British public sphere, arguing that Romanticism and theater subsequently reduced the identity of individual Indigenous person into cultural tropes. These themes also appear in performance studies, most notably in the work of Joseph Roach and Elizabeth Maddock Dillon, who examine how theater and performance can serve as harmful or empowering tools within the colonial world. Kathleen Wilson elaborates on the significance of performance as a site of knowledge in her most recent work, Strolling Players of Empire, where she argues that the modalities of 18th century performance, both on and off the stage, worked as embodied forms of knowledge. This scholarship is essential to understanding the role of the Georgian Masquerade as a performative commons that changes the masquerade from a space of innocent leisure to one of hegemony, where the body functioned as a primary site of knowledge acquisition and exchange through dress and performance. The continued performance of particular characters of empire throughout the 1770s and 1780s also speaks to the work of Felicity Nussbaum and Lisa Freeman, who have pointed to the significance of character recognition in fashioning identity, both of self and other, in their publications on theater. Monica Ellen Miller and Temi Ademosu present specific examples of character and type in relation to the character of Mungo from Bickerstaff's Padlock, highlighting the impact of visuality and visual culture in establishing racial stereotypes. Noemi Ndiaye further dissects the use of Black characters and bodies in performance and visual culture through the lenses of cosmetic application, speech, and kinetic movement. Her book, Scripts of Blackness, provides important insight on performative Blackness and how to examine agency in relation to performance and embodiment. This existing body of scholarship, while providing important social and cultural insights, has overlooked the impact of character and repetitive stereotypes in other forms, namely costume leisure spaces. While there are similarities between the embodiment of characters on the stage and within the context of costumed entertainments, the distinctions are perhaps more significant. The theater often included scripted or plot-driven performance, leaving room for improvisation in many instances. However, masquerade and fancy dress balls did not, leaving characters up to the interpretation of the amateur. Similarly, these spaces of sociability offer the participants the opportunity to be simultaneously audience and performer, allowing them to improve their interactions and responses as they wished. This gave the elites and striving upper middling sorts the opportunity to engage with the other and to reinforce and occasionally challenge the stereotypes they saw on stage, in travel journals, and in their own experiences of empire. For this reason, it is important to establish three key terms, and those are performance, race, and cultural appropriation. Performance can mean many things, and more often than not, when I think of performance, I think of script, which is not the case in this paper. I use Roach's definition, drawing on his work in performance studies, thinking of performance as a twice behaved behavior. So if you see someone do something, and then you behave how they just behaved, that is, according to Roach, in essence, a performance. So twice behaved behavior. The second term, race, is very sticky. I like to talk about sticky things. Race it had a different meaning in the 18th century, as many of you know. And I find that NDIA's concept of race, which draws on Stuart Hall's work, is the most useful when thinking about how ethnic and racial costume reflected hierarchical power structures. She positions race as a system of power disguised as a system of knowledge, used by the dominant group to justify the social positioning of peoples within a society. Regardless of period, race, quote, hierarchizes difference in service of power. The final concept is cultural appropriation. John Stiles, in a discussion, told me that he believes all dress and fashion are appropriative. And he starts his lectures with this controversial statement. Designers, makers, and wearers, even us, me, the reader, you, the listener, draw inspiration from pre-existing sources that they or we have encountered at some point in their and our lives. While I agree mostly with this statement, it is important to distinguish between this, inspiration and appreciation, and the harmful capacity of cultural appropriation. Susan Scaffidi's work on cultural appropriation and authenticity establishes the term via action and intention. She explains that cultural appropriation occurs when, quote, members of the public copy and transform cultural products outside of their own culture to suit their own tastes, express their own creative individuality, or simply make a profit. She continues, stating that this practice often leads to or directly involves a gross distortion of the target culture, its commodification, and economic exploitation. Eric Mathis further clarifies cultural appropriation as the representation of cultural practices or experiences by cultural outsiders, usually the dominant or normative culture. This is seen in the cases of the masqueraders that we will meet in the Who's Costume section. Cultural appropriation can thus lead to silencing, speaking for, and or misrepresenting a non-dominant cultural group, contributing to, and in many cases reinforcing, normative and hegemonic values and narratives. Okay, so we've got those three out, and I am happy to answer and discuss those in more depth during the question section. Now we're on Who's Costume. Masquerades were entertainment of the gentry, nobility, and the upper middling elite, which you have heard me wax on and on about. They were extremely expensive, and access was controlled through guarded doors, subscription lists, and tickets, which gave the entertainment an exclusive elite reputation that peaked in the 1770s and 1780s. In order to consider the question of whose costume and examine the extent to which cultural appropriation existed within this space, we are going to briefly encounter the stories of select masquerade participants, each of whom dressed as a character of empire. Our first masquerader is Edward Burney, who was a cousin to Francis Burney. He trained as an artist and would eventually be associated with the Royal Academy, giving him ties to the fashionable elite. Early in his career, his skills of reproduction were especially useful when preparing his Pacific Islander costume for a Pantheon masquerade in 1780. His cousin Charlotte reported that he visited Reynolds' studio to sketch the painting of Mai, which now happily positioned in the National Gallery, a native of the Polynesian Islands who had been persuaded to voyage with Cook to London in earlier years, used the portrait as a reference and produced a very convincing replica. Burney's dress was inspired by his interactions with Mai and made of several Polynesian fabrics, accompanied by a Tahiti stick in one hand. To further prepare and enhance his costume, he used, quote, a cosmetic of his own invention and preparation. He washed his mask and his hands so as to make them the color of omais, and he tattooed his fingers with blue paint and flattened the nose of his mask so that altogether he was so thoroughly disguised. He gave the mask special attention, spoke in broken English throughout the evening, and recited a speech in the Tahitian language, attempting to provide an authentic appearance to fool those around him. His efforts were seemingly rewarded when another masquerader, quote, came up to feel of it, the mask, to be certain that it was not his natural face. The combination of cosmetics, dress, props, and actions turned Burney into a convincing replica of a person from Tahiti, appearing to those around him as an authentic Polynesian rather than in the guise of one. Burney's choice in this instance and his efforts reflects the cultural expectations of the period and align with wider popularity of Hawaiian and Polynesian masquerade dress. As an aspiring artist, his convincing dress gained him entry into a fashionable space of sociability, and its singularity, accompanied by an entertaining performance, made him memorable within the night's revelries. As Ruth Scobie and Serena Dyer have shown, Burney's, quote, association with and appropriation of foreign aesthetics and language was a form of cultural currency that communicated his knowledge of current events, modern taste, and creativity to a wider influential audience. Burney's experience in creating and wearing his costume suggests that racial impersonation was more than mere dress-up and contributed to the larger racial hierarchies at work, signaling early stages of cultural appropriation according to Scafidi and Max's definitions. Our second masquerader is Elizabeth Sophia Plowden. She exhibited a similar desire to present an authentic ethnic costume in her choice of masquerade dress, but surpassed Burney in her commitment to authenticity and novelty. Plowden was an East India Company wife and member of the landed gentry who sat within the fashionable crowds in now Kolkata. As such, Plowden frequently attended masquerades and participated in a range of leisure entertainments, including theater, knot performances, balls, and sociable dinners. When attending masquerades, it was not uncommon for Plowden to wear Indostani, Persian, or Kashmiri dress, which dually reflected her knowledge and ignorance of the peoples around her through a romanticized version of them. At a masquerade in 1783, Plowden decided to pull others into her impersonation project, creating a band of Kashmiri musicians, dressing herself up as the singer. Plowden's correspondence with her sisters recorded the lengths to which she went in fabricating her costume and carefully selecting the people who formed the entourage around her. She explained that she was drawn to this form of dress because, quote, it had never been attempted at any previous masquerades, making it a novelty that would gain attention. Her dress was made of multicolored satins, gold, and pearls, as well as enough rings to cover each finger. She further explained, quote, my nails and the insides of my hands were colored red, which is custom with Eastern ladies. I had bells on my feet, a gold ornamented ring on my finger, which gave me a complete Indostani appearance, end quote. Her white peers, who formed the musical companions, were equally decked out in a mix of Indostani and Kashmiri dress, complete with accompanying instruments. In addition to these supporting roles, Plowden looked for a way to further enhance the authenticity of her costume and, quote, got a boy who had dark hair and eyes and looked like a Kashmirian to complete her ensemble. Despite the effort spent on the construction of this costume and her ensemble and her attempts at authentic impersonation, Plowden only lasted 2 hours in the dress. Sharing her relief with her sister, she wrote, after wearing my mask about 2 hours, I was glad to take it off and speak in my own language. The problematic nature of this habit is twofold and revealed through a close reading of Plowden's choice of dress, the language she used, and the props she employed. Firstly, the costume, like that of Burney, brought people of empire into performative commons through a white lens and by white bodies. In her letter, Plowden interchanges the words Indostani and Kashmiri, highlighting a lack of attention to distinction between peoples and languages, but pays very close attention when relaying the details of her elaborate dress. It's over 400 words long. As Plowden makes clear, this was a costume that she was able to remove as and when she pleased, returning to herself when the charade became too tiresome, identifying it was her body in her costume. The second and perhaps larger issue with this costume is the use of bodies as props, most notably that of the boy who looked like a Kashmirian. Unlike Plowden or the other members of this musical ensemble, the boy's use was determined solely by his appearance and brought in as an accessory object, shifting him from autonomous body to part of a costume. His physical presence added to the novelty of the grander costume and recognition Plowden expected to and did receive, marking Plowden's dress as culturally appropriative and symbolic of the racial hegemony that existed in Kolkata at the time. Plowden was not the first nor the last to use non-white bodies to elevate a masquerade costume. Predating Plowden's entourage by a decade, Miss Maria Monkton made her wealth manifest when she appeared as an Indian princess at a masquerade at Carlisle House in March 1770. She wore, quote, a robe of cloth of gold and a rich veil. The seams of her habit were embroidered with precious stones, and she had a magnificent cluster of diamonds on her head. Her jewelry was rumored to be worth 30,000 pounds, and some reported her splendid dress, quote, was attended by 4 black female slaves. Just over a month later, reports of a near identical, lavish, and expensive habit of an Indian princess circulated across newspapers, sharing similar stories. Goes into detail about her dress, but the bit I want to pull out here, which is her suite is to consist of 3 young black female slaves of different heights and ages, holding up her train, and 2 black male slaves supporting a grand canopy over her head. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to discover who this lady of high quality was, But the report itself revealed that using others as part of a costume was an option for masquerade dress. I am similarly unsure as to how the enslaved persons were acquired, if they were enslaved, servants, or free. However, their positioning in these roles reflects NDIA's definition of race as a system of power used to situate groups within social hierarchies. The mention of the dresses being made of Tavistock Street points to the consumer aspect of the costume, and the identity of the Indian princess and the body accompanying it were commodities, possibly inspired by Jeffrey's book. The listed value of the dress and jewels, when combined with the 5 Black enslaved people, presents a stark distinction between autonomy and bondage, and is reminiscent of Georgian practices of using Black servants in portraiture, which signified status, taste, and wealth. Temi Otomosu notes that in such instances, quote, the purpose of the African was the same, to accentuate the sitter's power or beauty through aesthetic contrast that also demonstrated how the innocent savage could be civilized in captivity. This can be applied to the choices of Bowden, Monkton, and our unknown lady of quality. The use of enslaved persons as decorative accessories provided aesthetic contrast and also signaled to autonomy for the lady, but limitation for them. Across these examples, it is clear that impressing fellow masqueraders motivated the choice of dress and lengths to which each went to create a seemingly authentic representation of another ethnicity. Racial impersonation therefore shifts into cultural appropriation, serving the interest of the person wearing the dress, reflecting their cleverness, and reinforcing existing imbalances of power. The role of the body as a site of appropriation within these examples is further clarified through the scholarship of Maurice Merleau-Ponty and Joanna Entwistle. Merleau-Ponty's theory of phenomenology and enactivism and Entwistle's work on sociology and fashion provide essential insight into the ways the body and dress together form a valuable point of scholarly inquiry into larger social and cultural questions. Merleau-Ponty's argument that the body is a primary site of knowledge is central to my work and these masquerade experiences. While costumes themselves are valid sources of evidence, understanding their contribution to reinforcing hegemonic hierarchies is incomplete without a body and movement, quote, because dress produces certain modes of bodily demeanor. Therefore, the haptic experience of wearing a Polynesian or Indian dress produces equal impact on the wearer. As Entwistle has convincingly shown, studying dress and the body makes dress, quote, a situated bodily practice, aimed to bring the totality of the dressed body into social analysis and continues to be a relevant starting point for analysis. Wilde also emphasizes this in his scholarship, arguing that fancy dress, and by extension masquerade habits, are always affective, and as such, quote, will have an impact on how the wearer and their audience feel and behave. This growing scholarly dialogue on dress, the body, and knowledge transmission thus positions embodiment and choice of dress as active contributors to wider cultural conversations on social and racial ordering, sustaining existing hegemonic systems. While the above accounts were relatively typical for white masquerade participants, Julius Deweese and Tanya Denega's experience provide important insight into the limitations of racial impersonation and how societal expectations impacted the costume options available to peoples of color, working to keep them within a system of racial ordering. It is at this point we are moving into the section whose body. This section examines these two men in relation to the existing costumes and characters which they wore to masquerades, Mungo and the North American Indian, respectively. My analyses are dependent on the work of Noemi Ndiaye, Monica L. Miller, Robbie Richardson, and Troy Bickham, each of whom have contributed important scholarship on the histories and experiences of Black and Indigenous peoples in the early modern world. Miller's conceptualization of character and type is particularly useful in examining how the characters of empire were performed in leisure spaces and influenced ideas of self-identity and other. Both Miller and NDIA highlight how character and type were shaped not only through dress, but also through objects, speech, and movement. Richardson and Bickham likewise emphasize the role various media played in conceptualizing the Native American and how the circulation of goods and images led to the creation of harmful stereotypes and manufactured barbarism in the transatlantic world. In its capacity as a site of elite sociability, the masquerade operated as a space for conspicuous display and allowed maskers the possibility of pushing social boundaries for a night. The masquerade was also a performative commons, however, where prevailing standards and hierarchies dictated bodily autonomy and habit selection, offering the gentry and nobility an endless range of dress options while limiting the choices of peoples of color. As we have seen, Bernie, Plowden, and others were able to transcend rank and ethnicity, moving vertically and or horizontally in their masquerade habit selection. This experience was not the same for persons of color, who could only dress horizontally or downwards, wearing the habit of another person of color or in the neutral, characterless domino. Oh, thought I put a slide in there, just kidding. During his time in London, Mai, who we've just discussed, attended several masquerades, though never in a dress above his rank or outside his natural skin color. Similarly, the Turkish ambassador dressed in a Turquerie habit at a masquerade in 1784, most likely wearing garments pulled from his own wardrobe. Julius Soubise likewise dressed within these parameters, taking on the character of a eunuch or Mungo. Soubise's masquerade escapade in Nocturnal Revels, a semi-fictional, factual novel, presents Soubise contemplating the use of powder to whiten his face. Soubise's acquaintance points out the idea of dressing as a sultan in whiteface is absurd. It is laughable and incredulous, making the eunuch a more appropriate masquerade choice for Soubise. Ashley Cohen's analysis of this scene argues, quote, the implication is that his skin color reveals his African ancestry, thereby disqualifying him from playing the role of the sultan who must be white, positioning him as only being able to dress horizontally. This, like other choices of dress, reflect the cultural expectations of the masquerade and the limited options available to peoples of color who were viewed as costumes in and of themselves. The experiences of Soubise and Tayandanega show how even within these limitations, they crafted characters and identities that, while conforming to larger cultural perceptions, also revealed humor, individuality, and agency. Upon his being brought to Britain, Soubise became a servant and son-like figure for the Duchess of Queensberry. As he grew into his place within the household, he became increasingly favored and worked as the Duchess's fencing master, which did not escape the attention of the public sphere. Satirical prints, including this one, circulated depicting his relationship with the Duchess, labeling him as her lapdog, Mungo. The name Mungo had cultural ties to enslavement and rudeness that were established in Isaac Bickerstaff's The Padlock, and was thus applied to Soubise. We can see the Mungo macaroni and the character of Mungo, and I believe that is dipped in blackface. Mungo's character in The Padlock was a mix of servitude and impertinence, making him a lasting character beyond the stage and fitting title for Soubise according to Georgian ideologies. Soubise's position at the Duchess's and the Duchess's generosity enabled him to indulge in all the gaiety and extravagance of the town. Quote, he constantly frequented the masquerades at Pantheon and Cornelis, where he was very naturally and much in character played the part of Mungo, by which name he was afterwards called. Though this account identifies Soubise's Mungo costume as the first connection between the man and the character, it is unclear if the lapdog print or the masquerade instance came first. Regardless, the resulting correlation between Soubise and Mungo shifted his body into one of performativity, removing the line between body and costume. Soubise's extravagant taste and enjoyment of London's leisure and pleasure scenes earned him the title of not only Mungo, but the Mungo macaroni, making the amalgamation complete. Mungo also became a popular character type for other masqueraders, mostly white men, who sought to take the character they saw on the stage and perform it within the space of the masquerade. Newspapers regularly mentioned a handful of Mungos, or a particularly interesting Mungo, or a dull Mungo, in their masquerade intelligence columns. And some of these Mungos included Captain Nugent, Mr. Mendez, the actor George Bland, and the fashionable Mrs. Crewe and Mrs. Bovary. In 1779, quote, Mungo's dress, striped silk, sold for 6 shillings as part of a masquerade warehouse auction, pointing to its existence as a commodity. This costume required blackface, which Felicity Nussbaum states was a necessary component of racial hierarchy. When worn by the likes of Captain Nugent or George Bland, there was knowledge that underneath character was a white man. Quote, In becoming Black, the white man can participate in the sublime thrill of Blackness. Yet in the very act of presenting it, he exerts some control over its effects. The performative component of this role, therefore, had the capability to further reinforce racial biases and hierarchies, leaning heavily into the fact that Mungo reflected, quote, the ethnic shorthand typical of blackface imitation. However, as Georgian London's Mungo Macaroni, Soubise would have influenced how the character of Mungo was worn and performed within the masquerade scene as well. His own experiences as a formerly enslaved person and Black man gave him authority on the role that could not be accessed by the likes of his white counterparts. As a popular masquerade costume, Miller's thoughts that Soubise would have encountered fellow white men in blackface during his visits to masquerades is highly likely. She goes on to explain the significance of this and how it contributed to Soubise's agency in shaping the character Mungo. Quote, what resulted from this confrontation was the establishment of the performativity of Black identity, the fact that it can and is performed by both Black and white. Combining public exposure to Mungo on the stage in the padlock with observations of Soubise's version at a masquerade would have jointly contributed to the construction of this character and type, bringing in a fictional, exaggerated component balanced with authenticity. Gretchen Gerzina further examines the complex relationship between Mungo and Soubise and how Soubise shaped wider cultural conceptions of Mungo, making the character into a symbol of folly as well as one of excess and extravagance. These were not redeeming qualities for Mungo or Soubise and reflected, rather than challenged, prevailing white assumptions about the character of Black men. However, Soubise's influence does reveal his agency in informing the way Mungo was understood within a larger cultural context. Ignatius Sancho, Black abolitionist, writer, and contemporary of Soubise, recognized Soubise's positionality and encouraged him to reevaluate his habits and pastimes, taking the path of a good gentleman rather than a fool. Sancho reminded Soubise, quote, Providence has been very lavish of her bounty to you, and you are deeply in arrears to her. Sancho's response to Soubise's rakish behavior and reputation as the Mungo Macaroni indicate the impact Soubise had on shaping and conflating presumptions about Black men, folly, and the character of Mungo within Georgian culture. Last but absolutely not least, we are moving to Tyendinaga. Although he was a visitor to London, Tyendinaga was no stranger to the city and was an effective and respected diplomatic emissary who was well-versed in British manners and decorum. His experience as a military leader and well-traveled gentleman informed Tyendinaga's awareness of contemporary British depictions of North American Indians as respected and feared warriors. He was known to frequently play these conceptions off one another, challenging the standards of polite society with bursts of savage Indian behavior. This tendency surfaced one evening at a masquerade, resulting in high anxiety and revealing reactions from those present. Tyendinaga attended the masquerade as a Mohawk, quote, richly dressed in the costume of his nation, wearing no mask, but painting half of his face. In a time when Indian costumes were increasingly common at the masquerade, his disguise, or lack thereof, attracted the attention of many present. The costume of the American Indian had grown in popularity during the second half of the century and took on the labels of either Cherokee or Indian within newspapers, and participants increasingly failing to recognize distinctions between indigenous North American peoples. This amalgamation and misidentification points to the colonial roots of the costume and the harmful erasure masquerade habits enabled. In his work on Native American studies, Gerald Weisner effectively establishes the colonial roots of the word and the label of Indian, stating it, quote, is a colonial enactment, not a loan word, and the dominance is sustained by the simulation that has superseded the real tribal names. The Indian was an Occidental invention. Weisner's approach to the term Indian and its colonial roots are clearly exhibited in past practices of leisure costume, which blends distinct cultures and identities into consumable fictions. While recognition of tribal differences appeared in Jeffrey's Dresses of Different Nations, which you can see on your far right, newspaper reports circulated mixtures and generalizations about North Americans, indigenous North Americans. Deloria and Richardson point to language mirroring as the main cause of this, with papers and references to Indigenous North Americans reflecting whichever tribes were in vogue at the time. For example, the Cherokees heavily populated the British public sphere during the 1760s and 1770s due to ongoing transatlantic news about relations with the tribe. This is also seen at the Masquerade, when in May 1770, a group appeared as, quote, an excellent Cherokee Indian with an Indian family. In February 1771, quote, the following characters claimed great attention. 3 Cherokee chiefs with a Cherokee lady of quality. As the century progressed, language shifted to merely Indian rather than specific peoples and were accompanied by depictions of Indigenous North American dress at the masquerading print culture, making the Indian into a stock character identified predominantly by a headdress, painted face, and tomahawk. Tyendinaga's dress was therefore not surprising, given the regular presence of Indians within masquerade spaces and scenes. However, his native dress was noted to have been particularly striking, which seems appropriate given it wasn't purchased as a masquerade habit, but rather his own dress. One masquerader was especially interested, expecting Tyendinaga's costume to be a disguise, and curious who was underneath. The masquerader, quote, scrutinized the chief very closely, and mistaking his rouge et noir complexion for a painted visor, took the liberty of attempting to handle his nose. Upon contact, the masquerader quickly realized the nose was real and not a part of a mask. Tyendinaga, who was occasionally known to play into the colonial perceptions of the savage, wild Indian, quote, made the hall resound with the appealing war whoop, and at the same instant, the tomahawk leapt from his girdle, flashed around the masquerader's head, causing women to tremble with terror, while others screamed and scuttered away in fear. Once the altercation was explained, it was merely laughed off and the masquerade continued. One sticky point here that came up when I did this in Newcastle as a test run is how humor is reflective of positionality, particularly when the academic audience is predominantly white, and the way that the stories and reports of these things are told and received. So it's something I'm still chewing through because it's very heavy, sticky material, but I just want to flag it here as something that if people want to talk about it afterwards, I would really welcome that. Tyendinaga's response to his fellow masquerader incorporated many of the cultural expectations of the people, white people around him, some of whom would have only known about Mohawks or other Indigenous Americans through print and visual culture. His actions, while feeding into wider perceptions, also align with the practice of Native survivance. In his work on survivance, Weisner argues it, quote, is an act of resistance and repudiation of dominance that is manifest across Native cultures and stories, nature, traditions, and customs. Tyendinaga exhibited aspects of Native survivance through his actions at the masquerade, waving the tomahawk around his fellow masquerader's head and releasing a resounding war whoop, demonstrate Weisner's humanistic tease. Dressing in his own garments and wearing his own identity made him an autonomous body, despite being viewed as a costume, creating a sense of self-produced irony. The playful teasing use of the tomahawk is also worth noting very briefly, not only because it signals survivance, but also because of its complex transatlantic history and rapid development into a trope of Indian cruelty. In his work on material culture in North American Indigenous people, Robbie Richardson explores the material literacy of the tomahawk and how, despite being manufactured in Britain, it became a powerful symbol of savagery and barbarism in the British imagination. While in principle, people were expected to remain in character through the course of the evening, his spontaneous reaction too closely resembled savagery and resulted in uncertainty and anxiety. Tyendinaga's actions, while in character, were seen as threatening and transgressed the confines of civility to the British spectator, but asserted his very real presence within the masquerade and wider Georgian culture. Like Soubise, Tyendinaga both played into his role and used it to affirm his identity as a Mohawk, employing the tomahawk as a double-edged symbol of Native identity and humor, challenging popular conceptions of Indigenous North Americans. We return to our 4 and move to the conclusion. The ability to become other through racial impersonation was temporary. It could be accomplished through a combination of dress, cosmetics, and props, further enhanced through adopted speech and movement. This process, however, was extremely harmful, not only because it circulated negative stereotypes and laid the groundwork for later practices of cultural appropriation, it made peoples and cultures into consumable goods, removing bodily autonomy and identity from the people behind each character type and replacing them with simulations shaped by white impersonations. The complete elimination of bodily autonomy is further evidenced in the treatment of non-white persons as props within the masquerade culture across the British Empire. Using peoples of color as accessory components within elaborate and spectacular costumes worn by white elites ultimately removed the autonomy from Black and brown bodies, aligning with existing racial hierarchies and reinforcing hegemonic ideologies. Before, during, and after the masquerade, wealthy white participants who opted for these costumes remained autonomous and as individuals, regardless of whose body or ethnicity they were wearing or objectifying for the duration of the evening. The option to discard or remove these characters and human accessories allowed elites like Bernie and Plowden to shift between temporary, figurative, disposable bodies and their own real bodies. This level of autonomy was not available to all masquerade participants, as we have seen. Soubise and Tyne-Nega's interactions with the masquerade provide important perspective on the experiences of people of color in costume leisure spaces and highlight the limited options of character dress available to them. Scrutinizing masquerade costumes through an interrogation of whose costume, whose body, provides important insights on the performative aspects of the masquerade and its wider impact in disseminating, reinforcing, and platforming practices of appropriation. Though the masquerade privileged white bodies in numerous ways and aligned with contemporary hegemonic ideologies, it also provided persons of color opportunities to influence and alter existing white crafted perceptions of these characters of empire. Examining agency in relation to performance, dress, and embodiment within the masquerade thus sheds new light on the role of the entertainment in Georgian leisure culture and beyond, with the experiences of persons of color showing how agency was achievable through ownership of both their costumes and their bodies.